Welcome to the premiere episode of Lost and Found, a new subseries of Unreleased that will focus on games and prototypes that were thought to be lost and the story behind their development, discovery, and eventual release to the public. This is Retro Impressions Lost and Found. In the early to mid 90s, it was fairly common for popular games to receive ports to multiple systems, resulting in the need for a new game designed from the ground up for each system. Resident Evil was one such game. It was developed for and released on the PlayStation in 1996 and later ported to the Saturn. It was a smashing success, becoming the top-selling game on the PlayStation up to that point, driving Capcom to invest in a number of sequels. While the PlayStation was the hottest game console, the Game Boy Color was the best-selling overall system and the next logical choice for the series. Capcom subcontracted UK-based HotGen Studios to develop a remake of the game from the ground up with an intended release date of 1999. HotGen took this rather seriously and painstakingly recreated the entire game to mimic the original experience from start to finish. HotGen finished the game as planned and shipped the final build to Capcom for approval prior to launch. Capcom responded with a simple statement to the press: "The game has been cancelled. We were not confident that the product would have made both customers and Capcom happy." With that, the finished game was shelved, and for years, fans of the series worried about its fate as it looked to be lost forever. On November 28, 2011, a user named Kif posted to Assembler Games on behalf of another user who wished to remain anonymous. Kif's acquaintance had recently acquired two nearly finished prototypes of the unreleased Game Boy Color game. The message was clear: the game wasn't for sale, but if the community wanted to raise funds to help cover the acquisition cost of the game, they would dump the ROMs. 2 short months later, $2,000 was raised, and as promised, both prototypes were released to the public. Both versions that were dumped are around 90% complete, and with a small amount of hacking could be played from beginning to end. Shortly after being dumped, a patch was released to fix the major bugs, allowing players to experience the entire game as intended, though there was no ending. For the most part, the game has received high praise for its ambitious use of the limited hardware, resulting in a rather enjoyable game. It's one that by all accounts should have been released and should be experienced by anyone who is a die-hard Resident Evil fan or a fan of classic Game Boy games. Near the end of the 80s, technology was advancing to the point that a number of developers started work on new arcade hardware capable of 3D. In December of '88, Namco put the finishing touches on Winning Run, which had been in development for 3 years, and released it to the public. It was the first racing game to use 3D polygon technology, and it blew people away. Just 3 months later, Atari released their own 3D polygon racer called Harddrivin. It didn't look as good as Winning Run, or even run as smooth, but it had one thing going for it. The game's physics engine was designed by a team of people who raced and designed cars for a living, giving it a very authentic feeling not seen in any other game up to that point. The game was only under development for 1 year and the cabinet cost $10,000, but it was still a smash hit, beating out Winning Run for best arcade game of that year on many lists. The popularity of the game would lead to a number of ports, including a critically acclaimed release on the Mega Drive and one on the Commodore 64, often cited as the worst game released on that system. Programming for the NES release was headed by Mark Morris, who had just finished a port of Road Blasters for the same system. Atari's development and publication house for home consoles was called Tengen, a company who at that time was embroiled in 2 bitter lawsuits with Nintendo. One regarding the unlicensed publication of games on Nintendo's system, the other regarding who owned the home console rights to develop and publish Tetris on home gaming platforms. The game was shown at a CES show and graced the cover of at least one magazine, but with the lawsuits, Tengen was feeling a financial strain. Harddrivin on the NES was an ambitious game, and to fully realize the dream of the development team, the game would require additional onboard processors, further driving up the cost of development. So even though the game was close to being finished and available for pre-order, it was shelved. Fast forward to 2009, and Frank Cifaldi posted an article on his website Lost Levels about Harddrivin on the NES. Mark Morris saw the article and reached out to Frank, eventually becoming friends with him. In 2013, Frank posted an interview on Lost Levels with Mark Morris detailing the history of the game along with a dump of the final prototype build. If you're into NES-style racers such as Rad Racer or are a Harddrivin fan, it's worth checking out. When most people think about the original Rayman game, they think about the version released on the PlayStation. I mean, it even saw release on the PlayStation Classic, further cementing the common belief that it was first and foremost a PlayStation game. The reality was, it started life on the Sega 32X before finally ending up being based on the Jaguar platform. It released on the Jaguar first, before being ported everywhere else, becoming the best-selling PlayStation game of all time in Europe. However, the road to making Rayman goes way back to the Atari ST. The game would eventually shift to the Super Nintendo PlayStation, where it got along fairly far in development before Nintendo and Sony parted ways, canceling the system. It wasn't a huge loss because the Jag was on the horizon and looked to be the first system capable of pushing games how the development team behind Rayman imagined making one. The rest is history, as the franchise continues to sell millions, being one of the most beloved platformers of all time. One oddity was for nearly 2 decades, everyone believed the game started on the Jaguar or PlayStation, depending on who you talk to. In 2010, French magazine Pix and Love published an interview with Rayman creator Michel Ancel where he revealed for the first time that the game was originally in development for the Super Nintendo Super CD. Information about the Super Nintendo game was slowly revealed over the following years, and on October 18, 2016, Michel posted a screenshot of the game, along with the announcement that the game had been lost forever. Rayman for the SNES was not the same game that was later released on the PlayStation, as it was confirmed to have its own storyline, where Rayman lived inside a computer which also employed him, and the final boss was a computer virus. October 23rd gave way to incredible news. Michel had found a ROM containing the original game, and it still worked. A game that had only been known to a handful of people and only seen by 4 was now preserved as he dumped the ROM to the public the following year. Though the game was nearly complete, the version that eventually was found and released to the public was a very early build showcasing a limited amount of what was there. It's well worth checking out what might have been the first Rayman game had the Super Nintendo PlayStation worked out, but it's not much more than a glimpse into what we've potentially lost. Bioforce Ape was first showcased at the 1991 Summer CES, where it received high praise for its incredibly fast gameplay and quirky design. Not much was known about the story, but everyone who supposedly played it had high expectations, so it came as a bit of a shock when the game was cancelled the following year without explanation. As time passed on, more and more people began to believe the game was a hoax, with the screenshots and press release all being manufactured by some unknown individual for a laugh. As 2005 came to a close, a user named PaulB812, also known as Paul Brown, posted a new thread on the Digital Press forums showing screenshots in a cart for the unreleased Bioforce Ape. As expected, a debate ensued between people who believe these items should be held for an investment and those who want to see lost games preserved. As the conversation grew, Paul continued to post pictures, including one of a special fart move so powerful it would blow away graphics and enemies. There was also screen caps of bosses who seemed to reference conversations in the thread, causing a couple people to question its authenticity, but for the most part, the debate ensued as people tried hard to get Paul to dump the ROM or sell it to them for their private collection. As the debate raged on, Paul posted a photo of the game now smashed into pieces, stating that he destroyed it due to the arguing it was causing in the forum. Again, a handful of people were skeptical, calling Paul out as a prankster, but the vast majority of the posters were on the fence, believing he really held the game, and the only prank was if the one he showed smashed was the real copy. He would later reveal that the whole thing was a hoax, aimed at testing his skills in design and to see what the Digital Press forum community's reaction would be. The story saw quite a bit of attention within the retro gaming community, once again bringing Bioforce Ape into the spotlight while reigniting the question as to if the game was ever real. Years would pass, and in March 2010, the same Paul Brown behind the 2005 hoax reached out to Frank Cifaldi of Lost Levels, notifying him of a Bioforce prototype that had surfaced on Yahoo Auctions, Japan. Cifaldi immediately went to work raising funds to pay for the auction he intended to win in hopes of finally obtaining the lost game. $2,700 later, Lost Levels had won the auction. With 2005 still fresh in people's mind and the auction occurring on April Fool's Day, many people had low expectations that the game was real, but much to the surprise of everyone, it was not only real, but in a complete state, to the point that it could be played from start to finish. Lost Levels would dump the ROM, making it available to the public shortly after receiving the game, and incredibly enough, it's gained a small cult following as it's a fairly decent game and visually impressive when compared to the hardware it's running on. It's a game that, in my opinion, everyone should play at least once. Thanks for checking out the first episode of Lost and Found. Let me know what you thought, and of course, a huge thanks to Frank Cifaldi and everyone else who puts in tireless work in pursuit of finding and preserving games thought lost forever. That's it for now. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Feel free to leave a positive or negative comment letting me know your thoughts. If you would like to chat or keep up to date on channel related news, follow me on Twitter at Jenovi. And until next time, you've been watching Retro Impressions.